I know Stanley already said it, but I think it deserves to be said again. A big thank you to everyone who was involved in yesterday's Fall Festival. Not only was it a great impact for the community, for all those who came out, were a part of it, to get our name out there a little better, to give us a chance to get to know people. But I'll tell you, as someone who was there, who was mingling around, who was watching people, I don't think I ever went past a person that didn't have a smile on their face, and a lot of that is because of all of you. So thank you so much for all you did, all that you helped with to make that such a great outcome and experience for all those who were willing to come and be a part of it, whether they were members here or friends, family, or anybody from the community. I just want to thank you so much for being a part of it. If you weren't a part of it, you'll get another chance next year, because we'll do it again, and we'll have other things for you to be a part of. But think about being a part of things like that, because they are a joy not only for those who are doing it, but those who get to be there as well. The week before last, we've been going through the book of Titus, and we were talking about the divine expectations that God has on leaders. We were looking at the qualifications for elders in Titus chapter 1, verses 6 through 9, and we were talking about those a little bit, but we were looking at the kind of expectations that people have. Well, at the very end of that section, one of the last things it talks about in verse 9 is that they are supposed to have the ability to refute those who contradict. The idea about being those who are contradicting God, those who are contradicting God's word, for anyone who's going to be a leader of the church especially, but for all of us, we need to have the ability to contradict those who are going to teach falsely. And right after that, we get into what we're going to be going through this morning, and that is verses 10 through 16, and it kicks off the discussion about those who are the ones who are needing to be refuted and or that are contradicting. It gives a good description of what we would call false teachers. And so this morning, we're going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about how we need to know our enemies, so to speak. We need to know who they are. We need to understand them. We need to have a goal as to what we are going to do about those who are contradicting the Word of God. And that is what Paul is trying to help teach Titus. You're going to see part of this being that until Titus does help elders get installed in all of these congregations or these home churches that are going on on the island of Crete, these people are going to be without leadership that maybe would be as strong as they could be. So that he's going to have to be a part of that, helping do these things, which means we all need to. So this morning, rather than starting off with an illustration, so to speak, I want to start off with a quote to help us understand maybe the importance of why we need to know our enemy. And I'm going to quote a book that I'm sure all of you have read word for word and never missed a single thing that it meant at any point in time. That is The Art of War by Sun Tzu. He says, if you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. There's something important about knowing who we are. We're going to assume this morning that we know who we are. But one of the things that we can definitely learn, not only from the Bible, but even from other people who write their own writings, is when we don't take the time to know who the enemy is, when we don't take the time to understand them, we might win that battle sometimes, but we're going to lose just as often as we're going to win. Now, whether we're talking about losing ourselves or losing others or maybe losing them, I'll explain that a little better. But I want you to keep that in mind as we talk about this morning. As we get into it, the first thing I want to get into is the enemy itself. We're going to talk about who they are, the way Paul describes them in these passages. He starts out with verses 10 and 11. He says, for there are many rebellious men, empty talkers, and deceivers, especially those of the circumcision, who must be silenced because they are upsetting whole families, teaching things they should not teach for the sake of sordid gain. So here's a little bit of what we see going on here. Here's a general description it gives. The first couple words it says there's many of these people. It's a common thing for someone to pop up and teach falsities, especially on this island of Crete. But not only is there many of them, it says that they were likely to be Christians. So they're coming in from among you, and not only just any Christians, but they're likely to be Jewish Christians. You can see that from it says that those of the circumcision, as well as other things that are mentioned later on we'll talk about, give the idea that these are potentially Jewish Christians that are trying to force old Jewish laws onto Christian thinking people. And so they're making Christians struggle because they're trying to put old laws on them. But it makes them part of this false teacher situation. They're causing things to be harder than they need to be. So that's kind of who we're talking about in a general sense. But it also gives their mode of operation in this passage right here in 10 and 11. In verse 10 it says that they are rebellious. These are rebellious people, the kind that are fighting a tooth and nail. They're doing anything they can to rebel against the gospel and what the gospel says. That's the idea of rebellion. They don't want to go along with it. They don't want to submit to the authority of God in any way. They care more about what they think or what they think is right. And they're more focused on the old law rather than just doing what Jesus asked them to do. It also says that these are people who are empty talkers. Now, the interesting thing about this word is it's actually comprised of the Greek words that mean vain or empty or even useless, and the word speak. And so the idea here is that these people are speaking things that are worthless. They're speaking things that don't have any consequence, really. They're talking about things that are really unimportant. By that he means spiritually speaking. It doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have the ability to speak. It doesn't mean that they aren't maybe eloquent in their speak. The fact is, they are probably very good speakers. They are probably very convincing speakers in the way that they talk. And that's why they're causing trouble, because they're leading people astray because they have a good ability to speak. But the problem is what they're speaking on has no value. That's really what it's getting at. It's not talking about them being mediocre here. It also talks about, and this is kind of what gives you the idea that they're not just mediocre speakers, is that they are deceivers. Again, in verse 10 it says. This is compounded of another word that means mind and deceive. It's an interesting combination, because not only does it shows this malicious intent, but when you think about those two things, your mind being deceived, you're talking about someone who is purposely going in to the way you think, understanding the way you think, and trying to change the way you think about God. Change the way you think about who he is, or maybe what he teaches and what they want you to know. That's an important thing to think about. They are intentionally trying to deceive the way you think, or the things that you know to be right. So we need to keep that in mind as well. It also says that in verse 11 they attack families. Now, the reason this is an important thing to understand is when you're looking at especially the first century church, you didn't necessarily have buildings like this all over the place where they met and they congregated. Most churches back then met in households. Sometimes it was just the family, or maybe the family and close friends that would meet together. And so when you see them attacking families, these congregations of families, so to speak, that are meeting in households, were susceptible to somebody coming in using fancy talk and trying to deceive them about what Christ is teaching them. And if they don't have someone like Titus, someone like Paul, or an elder to help keep them in line, they might be susceptible to some of those attacks or some of those teachings. The point being that the families, even today, families are the core of the church. If you start letting the families be attacked, if you start letting them being torn apart, guess what happens to the church? There's a real threat that's posed. And it can even be to the point of being catastrophic, because the church won't be anymore. You get enough people going around, especially when in a time where they had household churches, where they were meeting in their homes as families. You go in and they take over that whole family. They get rid of the way they think, and they start doing their own thing. You've lost a whole section of a church, a whole congregation gone like that, sometimes overnight. You can see the danger this is showing. The reason why Paul is telling Titus all of this, why it's so important. We also see that they're doing it for money. Now this is obviously something you see throughout the Bible, people who get more interested in money than doing things for the right reason. It's not anything new. It's not even the first time you'll see them use words like sordid gain. This is the idea that they're using whatever sleazy, you could say, means that is necessary to do whatever they need to do to make that money. Because they have a desire, they have something in their mind that they want, and they're going to go about whatever they need to do to get it. Now, when it comes to the island of Crete, something I want you to keep in mind is think about people who would maybe be holding their own personal gospel meetings, and they'd go around the island, and they'd go from one church or one home church to the next, and they'd say, hey, if you give me some money, maybe an exorbitant amount, he says, I'll offer you some words of wisdom. He's offering his ability to speak. I want you to think about that. That's the idea here. Now, these words of wisdom are useless. They're empty talkers. They might be able to talk big. They might be able to sound good. But these are people who are just trying to get you to give them money. Whatever they can do to get that. So they're offering these words of wisdom, and they need to be aware that just because they're words of wisdom does not necessarily mean they're wisdom from God. We need to make sure that we understand that too. The last thing he says as far as the mode of operation is that they're blatantly teaching error in verse 11 because they have turned away from the truth. And verse 14 is where it gets to that. They've turned away from God's teachings. They've turned away from the truth of the gospel. They can't teach correctly if they've turned away from what the truth is. And because of that, they are successfully dismantling the families that are on this island, the church members that are on this island, by teaching what is untrue, what is unhealthy. Continue on, whatever you want to say. They're teaching whatever they need to get whatever they want, regardless of how it affects the other people. This is who they are. But it doesn't stop there. In verses 15 and 16, it gets into their moral character. It says, to the pure all things are pure, but to those who are defiled and unbelieving, nothing is pure. But both their mind and their conscience are defiled. They profess to know God, but by their deeds they deny him, being detestable and disobedient and worthless for any good deed. So he gets into their moral character here. And this gets pretty bad. I mean, if you're thinking who these false teachers are, the way that Paul is describing them, I don't think anybody in this room would want to be described this way. He says first in verse 15, they are defiled. He says they're defiled being the opposite of purity and cleanness, but he's saying they're defiled in mind and conscience. Now think about that for a minute. Your mind is what you use to think. Your conscience is what is supposed to be dictating to you what is right and wrong, is the idea there. And so you have people that the way they think is defiled, is wrong, is impure, and the thing that tells them what is right and wrong is also defective. So they have no mode of doing what is right in the eyes of God. It is all about just whatever they decide to do or whatever they feel is best to do. That's pretty bad. They're defiled to that degree. It also says they are unbelieving. This is a matter of really refusing to believe God's teaching or regarding it as pure. And part of that is the fact that he says to them, nothing is pure. So they don't want to believe it. They don't want to accept it. They don't want to live by it. Really, in the end, they're unbelieving in a sense that they don't want to take responsibility or accountability for anybody else. They don't want to allow anybody to put something on themselves. They only put on themselves what they want. So they don't believe in God's teachings. It also says in verse 15, which I already mentioned, to them, nothing is pure. This is the idea that what God says is pure, the things that he is teaching, the things that he has taught, the things that Paul taught Titus, that Titus taught to the people, they don't consider any of that of importance. In fact, it would be even to the degree that it means nothing to them. They don't care what God has to say. All that matters is getting what they want. Getting what they want out of life. These are the kind of teachers that are coming in and why they're hurting the church. Because it's not about caring about those people. It's not about trying to build them up in God. It's not about trying to help them grow spiritually. It's simply about doing whatever they need to do. And so we see that this is part of the reason why they are so defiled and so unbelieving, is because they don't consider anything pure. It also says in verse 16 that they are detestable. There's not much you can say about this word. I mean, if you're going to be described this way, it's simply the idea that this is a despicable individual. You could even say the word disgusting. That's how bad they are. You don't necessarily want to be around them if you really got to know them. But on top of that, he says disobedient. So not only unbelieving, but disobedient. They will not elevate their will to above, or they'll elevate their own will above God's. They won't sync their will with God's. They won't give their will over to God. They will elevate their own. They're going to be disobedient to that point. They only believe in what they want to believe. Only what they want to hear, only what they want that'll get them whatever they need. And the last thing that it gets to, and this may be the one that you would think would cut to the heart the most, is Paul tells Titus, these people are worthless for any good deed. Again, I don't think worthless is something any of us would want to be called in our life. It's a heartbreaking word, especially if you think about it being used towards a person. Worthless. The reason they're worthless is because they're following man-made commandments. The things that they make themselves, maybe the things that they've been taught from other people, and they are unwilling to follow God. They're unwilling to follow His commandments, the truth of His Son who came down to this earth and died for them. And because of that, it renders them unfit for any good work. They aren't allowing themselves, as 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17, and they're not allowing themselves to be equipped for every good work by God and by His Word. Instead, they're using their own. And so really, they are worthless for it, because their intention is not to do good. That's why. It's not the fact that a bad person can't do a good thing. But the reason they're unfit for any good work is because they have no intention of doing a real good work. Their only intention is to help themselves. So that's the people we're talking about here in Titus chapter 1. That's who Titus is having to deal with. Now, we may not see people that we would describe to this severity today, but I guarantee you there's still some out there. There's still people who come into the church and try to do things to the church that would go along with some of the things that are taught here. Things that we need to be prepared for and aware of. But it's not just about who the enemy is, it's also about our response. Paul tries to help Titus understand how he should respond to these people. In verses 11 through 13, he says, who must be silenced because they are upsetting whole families, teaching things they should not teach for the sake of sort of gain. One of themselves, a prophet of their own, said, Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons. This testimony is true. For this reason, reprove them severely. So right there in those couple of verses, Paul tells Titus how you are to respond to these kind of people, how we are to interact with them or help them, so to speak. First, he says in verse 11, they must be silenced. Now, it comes from actually a really rare verb in the Greek, but it's really neat in the sense that it's talking about the idea of a muzzle or a gag, something you would put over the mouth to bridle something. Is the idea of this verb. So you're silencing it. It's really interesting that he uses this verb because of what he says in verse 12 about them being evil beasts. He brings in that idea that these people are beasts that need to be silenced, that need to be muzzled, that need to be bridled, and all of that kind of discussion. But let me tell you, the muzzling did not require you to put your mouth or to put something over the mouth of other people. They're always going to be able to say what they want to say. Especially in our country, as long as we have freedom of speech, we can't stop somebody from speaking whatever they want to speak. But the way that you silence them, the way that we combat that, the way we respond to that, is to preach and teach the faithful proclamation of God's word. To teach the truth. If they're going to turn away from the truth and they're going to try to take people away with them, the way that we respond to that, the way that we silence them, is not to beat them down, not to hold them on the floor, not to let them speak, but it is to teach what is the truth, to help people better understand what is God's way, to help them understand who they are following and what it means to be a Christian. Paul made this urgent to Titus because it was upsetting whole families. Like I said, this was the core of the church back then. You start losing families and you're losing everybody really quick. The same thing is true today. If people come in and they start attacking families and teaching them, if we aren't willing to stand up and teach the truth, we're going to lose families as well. And before you know it, we don't exist either. This is something that's important. Something Paul understood was important. Something we need to understand as well. It also says that they must be understood. You know, we said that this is about knowing your enemy. And this is where that comes in. In verse 12 to 13, he gives Titus a little bit of an idea of who he's dealing with. Not just their description, but who they really are. He says they're always liars. All of this comes from a Cretan poet, not an actual prophet of God or anything like that. Paul calls him a prophet, but not a prophet of God. The idea is that this comes from the 6th century BC. So this is actually 600 years before Paul says this. Think about that. 600 years before this, their own poets were already saying about these people that they were always liars, that they were always evil beasts, that they were always lazy gluttons. The idea here, as far as always liars go, is there became an actual part of Greek literature when they would say that you're going to play the Cretan. That means it simply was a way to say you're going to lie. I mean, I've heard in my past in history, I've seen in movies where people are described as Cretans. I never realized how involved that was going back to this island. Just what kind of reputation they built for themselves because of the way they lied. It was a part of life for them. It was normal for them. It was what they did with ease. It was second nature. Telling the truth was probably more difficult. Even if it would have been easy. They just had a nature of lying. It says they were evil beasts. The idea here is pretty important when it comes to evil beasts and lazy gluttons. The evil beast is the idea, when you're talking about something that's evil, you're talking about something that is morally reprehensible, something that is going against God. You add the word beast to it, and now you're talking about something that is not only morally reprehensible, but something that is potentially a monster. Something that could hurt, something that could destroy, something that could cause damage. And then you get to the word lazy gluttons as far as how they're described. The lazy in there being that they don't work for anything that they want. They take whatever the easiest path is. And then you add that word glutton to it, it means that they are never satisfied. So now not only are they lazy, but they are never satisfied and will always want more from whatever they're getting. Now you attach that to the idea of their sordid gain and they're doing anything for money and all of that. Think about the kind of people these are. They're people who will do anything that is easy for them to make a quick buck, as much money as they can in a short amount of time. I don't know if you can get a better description of potential con artists anywhere in the Bible than these people. I mean, that's kind of what he's describing here. But the reason Paul is telling them this is so Titus will have a better understanding of who they are. And knowing who they are helps Titus not only help the members of the church that he's working with, but it helps him to work with those people as well. One last thing that Paul says as far as understanding them is he says, this testimony is true. So Paul, an actual prophet of God, an apostle of Christ, he quotes a poet from 600 years before this, and he says, guess what? This is true. So now 600 years have gone by, and he says, basically, these people haven't changed. 600 years have gone by, and they're still this way. That's pretty bad. They have not gotten any better. In fact, they probably got worse. Paul says it's this way. Now, be understanding that this is not an indictment on all people on that island. Obviously, we do have Christians on that island. We do have people who are doing their best to live their life. But the people that are around them, the people in the society, in the towns around them, this is what they're dealing with. The average person, the influence that is upon them, what they're struggling with to get by. This is how they need help. Why they need good leadership. Why they need elders, as it was talked about in verses prior to these. They need that help. The last thing that he says as far as the way that we are to respond is to reprove. In the second part of 13, he says that we must reprove them. It means to literally express a strong disapproval of what they're doing, or something along those lines. It even adds the word severely when it talks about reproving them. And this means to do it in a manner that cuts. The idea being that it cuts at their heart. I mean, this is, you'd say what you need to say. And this comes back to speaking the truth of God. Whether they want to believe it or not, you tell them what God's truth is. And no matter how much it makes them hurt or whether they don't like it or not, if you tell them the truth and you reprove them for what they're teaching that is wrong, the only way that it can get better for them is if they're going to listen. Now, they will still have the choice to be who they always were. But if we aren't willing to reprove them and teach them correctly, even if it means them having hurt feelings or being offended by what you say, then you've lost them anyway, if we aren't willing to do our part. The idea here is that Titus is supposed to use the cutting edge of the sword of the Spirit. He's supposed to use that sword to teach the Word of God in the way it's supposed to be taught. To not let people like these come in and mess with all the other Christians that have been following Christ in the way that they should and be lost because they want to teach something different. Titus is supposed to step up and help them and get men who can be elders to help lead them as well, to keep these kind of people at bay, to stop these kind of people. Now, all of this being said, who the enemy is, what our response for them is, there's also another thing that Paul says in this to Titus that gives us an idea of what the overall goal is. And there should always be a goal, because the goal is important. He says, so that they, speaking of the false teachers, may be sound in the faith. Think about that. These are pretty bad people that Paul just described to Titus. These are people who are not doing good things and really have nothing good about them going on. But Paul says the point or the goal is that they may be sound in the faith. That's pretty important. He's talking about these false teachers that need to, as it talks about in verses, I think 13, 14, they need to not be paying attention to the Jewish myths that are being taught. They need to not be paying attention to the commandments of men. They need to be paying attention to the commandments of God. But the idea, the whole point, is that Titus is not trying to silence them just for the sake of destroying them. Titus is trying to help convert them. That's the goal. That's always the goal. God cares about their souls too. Just because they are doing what's wrong, just because they're teaching falsely, God cares about them. And I don't think you could ask for a better person to explain that to Titus than the one person who persecuted the church more so than anybody else. He says, God still cares. God wants them to be sound in the faith too. He wants them to be saved, to be a part of God, to be reconciled to Him. So it's not just about silencing or reproving or knowing them, but it's using all of those methods in the hopes that we can help save them. Save them from themselves even, but to help them get close with God again. God was still interested in them. He was not ready to give up, and we shouldn't be either. You know, and it talks about winning those battles, when it talks about how we are to do that or whatever you want to say, the point of winning those battles is not to destroy. It's not to humiliate. It's not to obliterate or anything along those lines. When it comes to the Christian battle, the spiritual battle, the goal is always to save, not simply to defeat. We do need to make sure we step up against those who are going to contradict God, to refute and to reprove. at all points where we can, but the goal should always be to save those who are lost, even if they're the ones that are standing up and refuting it. That's what God cares about, and that's what we should care about too. That's what Paul is trying to help Titus care about as well. You know, sometimes it's hard for us to agree with those who want to teach wrong or be evil or just horrible people. I'm sure we've all had people in our lives. Maybe if you're a kid or you remember when you were a kid, maybe you had a bully or somebody who picked on you in a way you didn't like. Well, guess what? I know many of us probably would have loved to get our win in that battle against that person in our life. But the point of winning is never to drop down to their level, to never just simply destroy them in the way that they've tried to do to you. The point is to be better, to help them be better. And that means following God, helping them find God as well. So that's the goal. We need to know who the enemy is. We need to know how we need to respond to him. And we need to know what the overall goal is so we have a direction of where we're trying to get them. Knowing your enemy is important. I don't think we can deny that. That's what Paul is trying to help us understand. Because knowing them in the end might help them be saved. But knowing them helps us too. Not only does it help us in working with them, helping us understand how to work with them, maybe how to better help them find God, but it also helps us to protect ourselves. You know, we started off with that quote that said, if we know ourselves but not them, some of those battles we're going to lose. And I said, sometimes you might lose them. But sometimes we might lose some of us. We don't want to lose any of us. But we don't want to lose them either. We want to make sure that we can win all of those battles. We want to know ourselves and know them so that when we think about 100 battles in the future, every single one of them, not only are we winning for ourselves, but we're winning for their souls too. Because that's what God cares about. He cares about all of our souls. That's how important it is to know your enemy. If you're here this morning and maybe you don't know yourself, you don't know where you stand with God, maybe you aren't sure exactly what the Bible is trying to teach you or what God wants you to know, don't wait. Let us help you get to know who God is, to better know what it means to be a Christian. If you have a need like that, we hope that you will come and seek help. Maybe if you are learning who God is and you have a good understanding of who you are and what the next step is, maybe you're ready to be baptized and be a part of the church. I hope you'll do that this morning and not wait on that either. But if you're here and you have any need at all, I hope that you will come as we stand and sing.